And the title of this panel is Still Mediated and Moving, the Image Today and Its Effects on Time and Space. I came up with this title after reading the abstracts of our three panelists. I thought to myself, this is perfect. This is the true link between all three of these topics. After reading through three very different papers, my understanding of what this panel would be about had drastically changed. Luckily, it was for the better. What unites the topics of these three panelists, at the very least, is the investment they put into three very individualized, thought-provoking ideas. In her paper, Representing the Experience of Touristic Spaces, Engaging Phenomenological Theory Through Image and Sound, Whitney Conti, a Master of Sciences graduate from the Department of Visual Anthropology at the University of Oxford, asks why text is the unshakable medium used in the conveyance of ideas in the scholarly world. She asks whether or not photography and film are the best technologies available to evoke the sensation of a specific time and place. With the use of stereoscopy and sound, she argues that we can travel through the stereoscope to experience a specific time and place apart from our own more authentically. In Paper or Pixel, the question of materiality in digital filmmaking, Sung-Young Kim, a Mellon Fellow at the Interdisciplinarity Center for Innovative Theory and Empirics and a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University, will be speaking about a return to material-based production of contemporary films or videos. She will discuss a new technique she calls still stop-motion animation, in which still images, for example photographs, are used to create motion in film. She states that, quote, perhaps this growing nostalgia for materiality signals a return to a conceptual reclaiming of the space-time balance. And finally, Sean Justice, a Doctor of Education candidate in the Art and Art Education program at the Teachers College, Columbia University, begins his paper entitled New Turnings of a Networked Age, Reconsidering Photographic Actions in Light of Curatorial Practice, by addressing the similarities of or relationship between contemporary photographic and curatorial practices. He argues that the invention and rise of photography does not represent as great of a sociological shift as is often assumed. It is rather a continuation of a centuries-old lens-based technology, though now the rapid dissemination of images no longer allows for personal reflection. He proposes that a new vocabulary and new understanding is in order. These, though, are only short and quite limiting summaries of the ideas included in our panelists' presentations.
Okay, I'm going to be presenting on this idea, this project I did called Materialism. You might have seen it loading in the YouTube, but essentially it's a combination of sound recordings and multiple exposure images, which I took with that stereoscopic camera from touristic spaces. So my presentation is really grounded in anthropology and the social sciences. So I hope it finds parallels in different disciplines, but I'm really going to be speaking to the humanities and the social sciences and how we can put more sophisticated media usage into what's traditionally a text-driven disciplines. So the title comes from tourism and realism, and I'm going to be suggesting that this kind of more surrealistic realism is close to our experience of the world. So I'm actually arguing for this as being more objective than saying just 2D images of physical buildings, which is why it then becomes Materialism, because it's touristic realism. Okay, so this whole project came out of this idea that everyone knows there's been tons of movements over the 20th century in most disciplines. So for example, some of the ones that have influenced anthropology, from the 1850s on, social evolutionary anthropology through linguistics, structuralism, feminism, then visual anthropology, sensory, and now phenomenological and material anthropology. And so there's been tons of widespread movements within disciplines. However, there hasn't been a reciprocal widespread representational practice or diversity of representational practices. We still primarily communicate these ideas in text. Why is this problematic? Because that's not always the most appropriate way. I mean, text can be, but there's also a lot of other mediums that can do that. This is specifically grounded as well in realistic issues of tenure candidacy. So for example, if a professor is really taking the time to do an advanced media project, an installation, is it getting recognized by institutions? Is it entering into the academic conversation? And then are we proliferating that so that more students can be doing these things? Because right now, a lot of media projects are done in academic spare time or on the side, or as something that's a community service, but it's not really being always acknowledged in the academic frame. So I'm gonna go a little bit into the first example of where there was a real partnering of academic theory and media usage. Unfortunately, in a way, because it was social evolutionary anthropology, which at the turn of the century, anthropology was essentially a construct of colonialism and trying to justify colonial expansion through creating racial typologies. So how can we kind of project all these cultural traits onto physical characteristics? For example, measuring noses or arms or things, and then projecting cultural traits onto them, and then just justifying colonial expansion, racism, all these things. And one of the tools of that, one of the ways that social evolutionary anthropology gained legitimacy was through photography. Because it's evidentiary, right? Photography is something grounded. It's something you can measure, it's something you can quantify. So this is a unique time when media was really used to be fitting with anthropological theory. So in my little graphic here we have, so the conception of the camera is like this. So if, at the turn of the century, the conception of the camera is of it as a physical recording device, as something that's based on reproducibility, the materiality, the evidentiary nature of it. That it's this kind of verisimilitude where it's just this exact copy. Anthropology at the time was also interested in this, about how do we quantify people? How do we put them into these ordered frames? So this was a unique time when both anthropology and photography, or at least the conceptions of them, were very fitting. So this is an example of an 1892 basic kind of travel guide for anthropology. And anthropology is a diverse term, so I'll just break it down really quick. It's mostly the study of humans and culture, and that's changed a lot through the 20th century. Archaeology fits within that. I do sociocultural anthropology, linguistics fits within that, biological anthropology as well. So when I say anthropology, I'm talking about different kind of phases in it at the time. So in the early 20th century and in the 19th century, it's mostly physical anthropology. How do human beings work and function? And so this is a common travel kind of guide that was taken by anthropologists. And as you can see, there's a ruler that's already on the guide. This ruler is not for measuring plant life. This ruler is for measuring people. And this ruler is for measuring traits. And you would see things like the encouragement of certain tools, sketchings, and even going to the trouble of printing color models for racial typology for skin color and eye color. Because this was the thrust, was how can we create a systematized prejudice, right, through quote-unquote scientific means, which at the time was quantitative data. So, for example, 1849, you're seeing these kind of Earth and Man encyclopedic things, illustrations of these races, quote-unquote. And then really graphic representations. This is what then became anthropometric photography, was using some kind of scale in the background through which you can measure and create a standardized system for measurement. So I'm only using this example because since this time, and even this even goes into the 1930s, anthropology and the eugenics movement used a lot of anthropometric photography to justify Nazi expansionism, things like that, because there was this idea of a scientific underpinning, and photography was one of the basic ways that they created an evidentiary base for that.
I'm actually a Greek art historian, but I'm writing a dissertation on time concepts in Greek art, actually. And my interest in film actually came out of this interest in the relationship between time and art. And so it happens with the invention of cinema, the way we relate to art vis-a-vis time has really radically changed. So that was kind of my interest. And then I had a few friends who were doing really interesting work, who are filmmakers and actually present in this audience today. So that's kind of where it came out of. And as it is customary in academic art historic papers, I will deliver a red paper. So, okay. Actually, I need to turn down the sound a little so you don't get distracted with the sound. Okay. An overhead shot. A single Polaroid picture, still undeveloped, rests against a textile surface. 6 seconds later, the image of the protagonist fades into existence. Overhead shot. A hand lays down a piece of paper with an indiscernible gray halftone image. Suddenly, several are stacked up, a pile is forming as another piece of paper is added. The hand adjusts the last piece. A wide-angle shot. Xerox machine spews out pieces of paper. Some are scattered about on the floor. Cut to close-up, another piece is printed. There's nothing unusual about these first few seconds of 3 music videos, which capture a finite slice of space-time reality, with only the video camera as mediation. It is only time which has been condensed by standard editing techniques. Then, taking cue from the first major beat of music, a sudden shift of paradigm in the screen image takes place. In Dan Askell's music video, Breathe Me, the Polaroid still of the singer Sia in a frame within a frame suddenly comes to life as more Polaroids are added on top, 12 to be exact each second. In Jason Wishnow's Seahorse, the blurry halftone image of a snowy streetscape suddenly fills the frame and starts moving like a newspaper picture at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I'll let this run just a little bit. And finally, Diamond Dog's Mirror Kissers cuts to what must be a printed image from the Xerox machine, with Xerox band members performing their opening act. As if to remind the viewers that they're printed figures condemned to a 2-dimensional plane, real hands appear on top of a largely black and white printed surface. These are the beginnings of 3 different digital music videos that use a common technique that combines still motion and stop motion animation. The traditional stop motion animation technique, originating from the 60s, is by now an exceedingly well-known cinematic form popularized by the British short series Wallace and Gromit. From the brothers Quay to Tim Burton, stop motion has been variously used to tantalizing, surreal, and even uncanny effects. Inanimate objects are moved in small increments between individually photographed frames, which generates an illusion of movement when played at the speed of 24 frames per second. But the medium itself, which is still photography, is usually not explicitly acknowledged. Still motion, on the other hand, is not necessarily an animation technique that generates an illusion of movement. Rather, it stitches together various still images not necessarily related in rapid succession with an explicit acknowledgement of the inanimate character of the individual frames in order to create a dynamic and psychologically intensified effect. The videos showcased here, however, do explicitly acknowledge the individual frames as photographic still images, as they are used to generate the illusion of movement. Let us dissect the various processes a little more in detail. In Wishnow's Seahorse, standard footage was taken with a handheld digital video camera, edited into a coherent 3-minute piece, every single frame then printed as a halftone image on legal-sized paper. Over 4,000 individual printed pages were then re-photographed one by one to reconstitute a 24 frames per second moving image. And so you have that last bit. Askell's Breathe Me used over 2,000 Polaroids shot in live stop-motion style, which are embedded in the digital video footage to create a multi-layered space-time reality. Starting with a 12 frames per second superposition of Polaroid images that create a choppy flipbook-style movement. The camera then zooms into the last Polaroid picture so the frame margins are no longer visible. It then carries on in normal digital video mode. We move down the stairs and see hundreds of Polaroid images scattered about until we encounter Sia carrying a Polaroid picture of herself against her chest. She variously adds or subtracts Polaroids, and we find ourselves witnessing another still stop-motion animation. And this process repeats itself, as you're going to see just now.
So I'll just start off by saying very briefly that I come at this project as a photographer, that I have been in photography for my entire life, pretty much, until very recently. In fact, I no longer really consider myself a photographer, but I teach photography, and it, it often leads to some interesting conversations in my classes about teaching photography and not believing in photography. So that's a fascinating dichotomy for myself as a living, breathing human being and fully ensconced in the material world. So my brain is just completely on all cylinders because we don't know each other, but we have so many similarities in thought processes. But I will take a slightly different tack and argue that photography as a word and as a practice is actually not ontologically new at all. And in fact, by continuing to think that it's ontologically new, that we actually do ourselves a cultural disservice. Sorry, fine motor control and thinking at the same time. Just 1 second. Okie dokie. Okay, so the name of my paper is New Turning of a Networked Age, and the paper goes into a lot of detail about curating, because I came to these thoughts based on I was invited to discuss curating and photography, the connection of curating and photography, because I've been doing a little bit of curating recently, but not a whole lot. I'm not a professional curator by any stretch of the imagination, but I decided that I was going to, in these notes today, because they're much briefer than the paper at large, I will talk primarily about photography. So the curatorial side of this whole thing is absent in that regard. Okay, so the first thing is that to say that what I'm interested in and the questions that I'm asking in my dissertation research as well as in my art life is what effect do digital networks have on our practices, on our various practices? And in art education, it's what effect do they have on art education? And in terms of my art practice, it's what effect does it have on my insistence to keep teaching photography? And this idea here begins from a couple of different things that I want to kind of spell out in terms of networks. So what is a network? And very, very simply, at its most basic level, a network is a connection. Now, these thoughts are inspired by the work of Castells and Gallery and Thacker and Manovic and a lot of different people, but I'm just going to talk as if they're my thoughts, but obviously they're not, so you guys remember that. The idea is that one of the key things about networks is connection, human connection, real human connection, like on the sidewalk or at the bodega, and occasionally there's a robot involved. The other thing another thing to start with networks is that the shape of these connections are changing drastically, and they're really much more in the digital network. We really have to come to grips with the idea of relationalities of networks and the speed up of those relationalities so that we communicate much faster and much more quickly and much more unpredictably than we do when we're on the street. And you all know what it's like to be talking to somebody and then be interrupted by somebody who comes up. And that doesn't really bother us in the digital world, but it does bother us in the analog world. So the second thing to keep in mind is the relationality of these connections. And the third thing is a little bit trickier to kind of display, but I'm just going to kind of go through these couple of animations here. So the third thing that I want to focus on has to do with openness, and I would even say a radical openness. And the idea is that within the digital network, if an individual node closes, part of the network dies. So it's ontological, it's existential, that there is a necessity of openness in the digital network, which we've never really experienced before. We all talk about we have to trust each other and that person lies, and I'm not going to go over to that guy's house anymore because it's no fun. But in the network, if a node closes, the network dies. And so that means that we all of our individual digital lives have a direct overlap with what happens in Syria, because if Syria closes off their internet, that's a massive node. That's a massive node. Now, is it a key node? Will it kill us all? Probably not. But what node would kill us all? The closure of which node would kill us all? And that's a question that we're not asking. And I think that directly has relevance to photography. So radical openness. So those are some things about networks. Now, the other thing I need to touch on is where I'm coming from in technology, because the sense of technology that I'm really interested in is technology as a way of knowing. And these thoughts are inspired by Heidegger and phenomenology, but especially a guy named Maynard, Patrick Maynard. The references are in my paper if anybody's interested. And the idea being that within technology as a way of knowing, that technology reveals or conceals dimensions of our experience, and that what we often get focused on is the new gizmo. But what I'm interested in is how the new gizmo changes the way we experience our lives. So this is a story, an anecdote from my personal life to kind of illustrate what the hell I'm talking about on that. But this is a map of my early childhood. My house and the pool. My sport was swimming twice a day, 2 practices a day. Mom and Dad drive me in the morning, pick me up, drive me home, twice a day. this road that went between the house and the pool went through a mountain pass, and this road was etched into my physical being, my neurons as a child. And the dimension of the road involved the swerving left, swerving right as you went around these curves. If Dad's driving, the swerve is a little heavier. If Mom's driving, it's a little straighter. Mom and Dad got tired of that and said, "You're going to ride your bike." And I remember, this is also seared into my experiential memory, that road had hills. And in the car, the dimension of up and down had been completely hidden. But on my bike, I was panting and puffing, and then all the way down to the bottom of the hill. So in my current adult life, thinking about phenomenology and the history of technology and these other things, I realized that the technological choices that we make deeply affect what's revealed and what's concealed. And choosing one technology reveals one thing, choosing another technology conceals another thing. And there's many different ways we can talk about that, but so that's an idea that to think about technology and how I'm approaching this.
One question that I thought might address all three of your presentations, in which questions arise concerning the materiality of the image and concerning distribution, etc. The dematerialization of the images and the ease with which they are so abundantly disseminated, as in Sean's discussion of the Abu Ghraib photos, seems to result in a greater potential to use these images as weapons. Yet in Whitney's discussion of the beneficial effects of stereoscopy, it seems as though the dematerialization of the image might allow for a more objective understanding of place and its people. Might you be able to talk about how materiality factors into these ideas, and is there a way these seemingly opposed ideas can be reconciled?
I really think that's the question of our time. For me, I think that's an critically important question. I thought it was fascinating that Whitney actually has a graphic of the photography carrying through, but the culture of anthropology getting mixed up, and you drew the line between them. That anthropology is not dealing with, or the culture of, I'm not saying it the way you said it, but.
Yeah, I mean, that was more the conception of the camera. So how do we conceive of the medium? So mediums can do anything, I mean, I believe, It's more how do we conceive what they do. I don't think a camera is strictly just a recording device, obviously. And, there's been generations of people who say otherwise. But, when we conceive of it as the same thing, how do we then use it? So the idea is that the conception of the cameras remain kind of stagnant in a lot of the social sciences. And theory has changed dramatically. But the two haven't really worked together since kind of dramatic depictions of anthropometric photography. But as far as materiality, I mean, I think it's a really changing time that we're thinking of materiality different. Like, for example, in a lot of digital interfaces, we're still interacting with the material world when we're using a computer. Our fingers are touching a keypad, we're touching the iPad, we're using everything materially, but where is the frame? What are we conceiving as the discrepancy between what the content is, whether it be 5 movies on your desktop, and your interaction with those? Are you interacting with the computer, or are you interacting with the movies? And I think that in some ways that's a new question, but in some ways it's not. When you go to a movie theater, you're interacting with a chair, but you're visually interacting with the movie.
And you're hearing everybody around you too.
Yeah, so I think what you drew attention to is how our attention to the frame and guiding users' attention to the frame changes. And I think that's what's been lost in this idea of losing materiality, is no one cares about the frame right now. It's all about the content as removed from the computer, as removed from the iPad. You want to see what's going on in Syria on your iPad on the subway. You want to be in Syria, you don't want to be in the subway. So, I don't know, I think those are the kind of the questions of the shifting frame and our attention to it right now.
Because I wanted to make a response to what Sinjan said, because in regards to that is that when last night we were talking about the materiality, the hyper sort of like fetishization of the materiality, in a sense, when you said that last night, I was thinking, because I think a lot of us are reacting to, I don't know if you'll buy the idea of the collapse that I just described, but one of the ways to reject the collapse of the inside-outside is to insist on the outside. Well, the materials that are not part of my body are, by definition, the outside. So that is like this interior reaction to this collapse. Maybe that. I don't know if any of the filmmakers would articulate it that way, and it may not even make sense whatsoever. But when you said it, and when I saw that, it made sense to me. So.
Well, there are a few filmmakers in the audience, I think. And by the way, is Dan Askell here by any chance? Didn't make it. Okay.
Mm.
I've never met him. We just talk over the phone, and he said he would come. But I think, I have two responses. One is that this collapse of sort of the inside-outside matter and self, or is actually like a turn of the century idea. It starts with phenomenology,
Right.
and the likes of Husserl or Merleau-Ponty, who really kind of went with the idea that what does perception mean? Like when you're looking at an object, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are we basically kind of sending out rays to detect this
Right.
three-dimensional world around us, or is it that this world is just being sensed internally? And so there is already like a philosophical collapse between sort of matter and perception. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that, in fact, I think what we're living in today's world, what's key is this word new when it comes to when we say new media.
Mm-hmm.
And, how do we define new? And there's some, as far as I kind of read up, there's some notion that new media actually means being aware, self-aware of its material or its materiality, like questioning what it really is. And so there's this unrest, and obviously we're dealing with a lot of these issues.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe in 10 years and 20 years things might be different and kind of settled. But when you think of, back when Benjamin, talked about the loss of aura in the age of mechanical reproduction, this was a complete different way in which we relate to images. And there's a return to that idea, which I mentioned in the paper, nowadays when we're talking about like complete loss of sort of analog ways of reporting things. And that also harkens back to what does it mean, what does original mean? There's no such thing as an original now, and like the file that you make is completely reproduced with a touch of a keypad. So anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to say about our current status and the newness of this piece.
I have a question for Sungjung.
Sungjung, yes.
In talking about Bazin and kind of ontology of film image, there's been a lot of reconsideration of Bazin in the past, 5-10 years, and people are, people who kind of accuse him of being a naive realist, in the 60s and the, heyday of structuralist theory are kind of recanting and, saying, well, you could read it in a more discursive or ideological way, because what Bazin's really talking about is not so much the index itself, but our belief in the image, our desire for the real, which is necessary for the experience, for the image to bear our faith away, right, as he puts it. So I'm wondering what role does kind of, today in this kind of fetishization of the analog within the digital, what role does, desire for the real, belief in the technology, knowledge of the technology play, in shaping our experience? Because, someone like D.N. Roderick, I'm sorry, I'll stop in a second, but,
You're doing all the work for me.
I'm on my soapbox right now, because, D.N. Roderick thinks that looking at, a photograph that's on like a video monitor is experientially totally different from looking at a photograph on the wall, because, the frame rate or something, it's not totally present, because the image is refreshing, so the image is not ontologically there at any one point. I don't really buy that. Like, I'm just wondering, what is the role of, belief, desire, and knowledge? How does that complicate or play into the kind of work that you're doing? Sorry.
Okay. There's several things there. First of all, wow. Okay. Well, going back to sort of that picture in the last moment that I flashed of, I think almost everybody would have done the same thing, in that there's this very deep-seated nostalgia for a time past that is no longer here, right? And then we can go through this whole philosophical argument about whether past really existed, but we're not going to go there. But it's it's somehow this nostalgia that I'm trying to get at, and the desire for the real, I think is kind of is kind of intuitive in a way, and it's really something that, you know, by theorizing, you know, all these things over time, like we kind of lose touch with like the actual intuition that is so obvious to us actually. And yes, you know, the first thing that came to my mind with those pictures, I mean, it doesn't actually show the sound or the smell that I've you know, put up, but like, the first thing was like, okay, well, I'm gonna have to make do with the digital image of the ruined photographs. At least I have a record of it. And in some ways in my mind, that digital reproduction was replacing the actual material object, but in a way that's substitutive and not ontological. And I think sometimes we kind of, you know, need to get out of that theoretical frameworks that we love to read and actually listen to our internal sort of instinctual. But I mean, I don't know if that answers your question. That answered your question.
But I mean, in terms of that, just to continue with that, do you feel, because I mean, we talked last night about how what was interesting about these photographs and these Polaroids was that they were kind of like handed out to friends afterwards, so the material was, you know, it was around afterward, it wasn't thrown away.
Right.
But how do you think that relates to, for someone who's just watching the videos and seeing that, okay, there's materials being used in here, it's not strictly digital, and how do you relate that, as you said, to the Benjaminian aura, or a return to it?
So basically what Benjamin talks about in terms of this sort of loss of aura is really about like an authorship. So, you know, for instance, a painting that has no reproductions made of it, but then he thinks of aura as the loss of aura, or the distancing of it, is actually a good thing in a way, and that it changes the way that we relate to these mechanically reproduced images. And I think I just see the parallel nowadays with digital material, the digital media, is that we are actually kind of losing that. You know, we no longer, the filmmaker will no longer keep like a canister of celluloid that was like the original, like, you know, copy of the product. And that, you know, there's a sense in which, you know, this kind of aura is being revisited conceptually. And of course, you know, a lot of the filmmakers were saying, you know, either they were autographed and handed out with the CD, since it's a music video, or in the case of that 4,000 pages printout, he was actually going to discard it until a gallery owner friend said, like, no, you can't discard that. It might be useful later. And, you know, it's all about like artistic value that is nowadays, you know, being sort of subscribed to a material product because there is a progressive loss of it. And on the other hand, we have, you know, things like Damien Hirst, which just explodes in terms of like material value. And I mean, a lot of this tension between value, material, and reproducibility and uniqueness is, you know, very much prevalent in today's sort of changing way of we think of material and media. So, I mean, I don't know how else to address that, but I mean, you know, we could open up discussion maybe if anybody else has, you know, some thoughts or.
I have a question. I was fascinated by the parallels between all three of your presentations. They're all and one thing that Sam and I discussed when we were looking at the papers last week was about the ethical dimension that comes into the discussion, particularly, Sean, the way you ended. I know that part of the paper was a little bit compressed in this context. With the Abu Ghraib photographs in reference to the Rutgers case, and maybe it comes into your discussion as well, this implication that there is an ethical dimension to insisting on the importance of the materiality of the image. And the erratic the Benjaminian erratic is definitely a moving target. That's something that you all sort of noted. Where we find that erratic is something that moves all over the place. But you all seem to have somehow arrived at the idea that there's this kind of moral dimension to materiality. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Any of you? Maybe Sean, you could start.
I would say, I would agree with you that I do think that's true, and I think that that's a culture-wide shift. I kind of think that what we're doing as individuals is a response to the way that we're all sort of bumping into each other and moving around. It's like, the emergent properties of flocks of seagulls or tree rings is a metaphor which goes beyond metaphor. I think it really is a description of the shared world, description of the material world. I think we've come to grips with this phenomenology, and the beginning of this process started a century ago, I think, which makes sense, really, that we've reached the point now where our technologies are beginning to embody the shift in thinking. But we're in a tide goes in, tide goes out sort of a situation. We're in the in-between tidal zone. Nothing's growing yet. I mean, things are only gonna really start taking root when there's some pools or when the tidal zone is more stable. But right now we're in this, and maybe we're always in the intertidal zone. Maybe that's the way life always is. But I think we're aware of it in a way because of our digital technologies, perhaps, or at least that's what I'm thinking about. And so I think it makes sense, sure, because we're learning how to live and work with each other in newly emergent ways. So I think it makes sense. I think it makes total sense that we're now thinking about the ethics of human relationality in a different way, in a very different way. And I mean, it's culturally, we can point to so many cultural movements. The rise of gay marriage from 4 years ago. 4 years ago, gay marriage was like, can't discuss it. We're not going there. Today, it's like 36 states. It's amazing. I mean, it's like turn of a page. It's almost crazy in a way. But I do think the ethics are critical. And from my perspective, one thing that we're really in danger of is suppressing the importance of the ethics.
So suppressing the materiality itself, or our sense of a connection as embodied viewers to the image.
Yeah, I really think material is critical. I mean, much more long-winded, but yeah, I think that's how it is. Materiality is the medium through which we express our humanity, and without that, we're robots.
I would probably say in a less kind of conclusive way that I think the materiality, the attention to whether you use it or not is really all that's important as far as me. Is placing moral judgments is one thing. Placing a value judgment on whether it's done or not, I think is sometimes not the right question, whether it's appropriate or not. And I think there's been a lack of attention to materiality in a lot of cases, which is where we feel that loss of it.
Mm-hmm.
Versus attuning to, okay, well, I'm not going to emphasize the physicality of this, but I'm going to emphasize something else. And being aware of that, ignoring the ignorance of it is fine for me, as long as there's the awareness in the selection process. The value judgment, I think, is up to the project, and that's the intention, of course.
I wanted to throw this out there as a kind of provocation, but we were talking about this tension between materiality and dematerialization, but the fun part about the 21st century is that everything is coexistent. I mean, like Douglas Engelbart, when he did this project with the mother of all demos, where he shows you the idea of tactile, kind of moving in the screen. The iPad's only been out 2 years. I remember it's like April 2010 is when the first iPad came out. But the idea of the screen, I mean, there's a very funny phrase that Nietzsche says, when you look in the abscess looks back at you. But we're now saying when you look at the network looks back at you. I'd love to hear what you guys think about stuff like Predator drones or Google Glass, the kind of the new sunglasses that the two executives at Google are kind of,
Sure.
and especially in the era when you look at people like William Gibson and mirror shades and these kind of dual-purposed, kind of two-way, kind of portable media. It's not. I mean, Sean especially. I mean, you're talking about relational aesthetics. That maybe is a problematic. What do you think?
Man, I love it. I'm just thrilled. You know, I think life is just getting better and better. You know, it's getting crazier, and I think if we just maintain and just kind of take a breath and concentrate on being embodied souls that are, you know, in love with the whole thing, I think we'll be all right. I think the problem is, it bothers me greatly. Predator drones and all this stuff really keeps me up at night, really, in a weird way for, you know, being comfortably living and where we are. You know, I don't have to worry about it yet. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it is. It's fascinating and problematic, and I love the tension of it.
I would just say that I think it's interesting that I don't think that a lot of what's going on in technology is necessarily new ideas. It might be a different format, it might be a different technology. But as far as the ideas, I don't think that's, I mean, like I said, 3D is from the same time that photography came about, 2D. So that's like 1838, you know, and that's still painted as the futuristic kind of medium, but really, you know, it's not, it's just taking different shapes. I think it's also an interesting trope in technology usage, in this kind of dystopian technology, where we look at the world and everyone's got their headphones on and they're disconnected from what seems to be the real world. And when that's portrayed as somehow dystopian, is also not new. I mean, there's images of classrooms of people using these futuristic, you know, looking kind of stereoscopes from the early 20th century when these were in schools. And I think one of the reasons that those didn't become popular, and they didn't become widespread, is because this idea of disconnectivity is scary, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we haven't thought of it before, and we haven't done it before. And there's also, I think, a romanticization in technology where you say this idea of control. So for example, we love the idea of a farmer taking a shed and an axe and picking our vegetables for us. But when there's a farmer in industrial farming that's trying to keep up with the machine who's doing that and is just kind of chopping the pig as it goes along so that the human then becomes the machine, we're much less comfortable with that. So it's like, when are we comfortable with these technologies and when are we aren't? Because a tool is a tool in some ways. And it's like, when does this idea of the control become what scares us? I mean, I'm not making a judgment on whether it's good or not, but I think that's telling of a lot of our responses to new technologies, is our idea of who's controlling who. Not necessarily the ideas of technology themselves.
I have another question, I mean specifically about your project, but I was curious how you distinguish the tools used, I guess, to create a more accurate experience of a place, and rather, as opposed to different tools which only trick our senses into believing that we have experienced that place more accurately. You know what I mean? Rather than...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the accuracy thing is really funny because I think most media photographers would never be necessarily arguing for positivism or objectivity or accuracy because of how detrimental it's been to a lot of 20th century politics. You know, for example, anthropometric photography, the images of, you know, measuring people, the reason they were so dangerous was because of that belief in their objectivity, which, as you know, any mediators know, there is an ultimate objectivity in the image. But I think the question then goes to, it was more specifically the idea of tricking versus not.
Yeah, rather than looking at a photograph of, you know, where a touristic space, to actually have, assume, you know, something projected into your eyes or watch it on a screen and sound. How does looking at that image and being separated probably at a greater distance from it, rather than being, you know, totally immersed in it, is that more of a trick, or is that actually, you know, getting us closer to the actual experience of the place and perhaps the people?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I don't really believe in like a literal idea of it is or it is not. But I think it's the question then can become as well, why are we using these technologies and what are we trying to do? So if you're trying to do something phenomenological and use more increased ideas of experience, multi-sensory experience, then these, I think, I'm arguing for, are becoming more objective ways or more accurate ways of representing these spaces because I think there's still, our genres of media are still segregated to this is artistic, or this is an experimental project, but it's not necessarily something that's has scientific merit, whatever that is.
Yeah, we run into that all the time, don't we?
Yeah, and I think this is problematic because we see, I think, a further segregation. There's more maybe interdisciplinary collaboration now, but the social scientists are becoming worse at media, it seems, and the media people are becoming better, which is great, but sometimes if we don't kind of payroll the idea of both of them being appropriate, then they're not happening. So if you're doing an architectural study of what the buildings look like, then you gotta take a 2D image. But if you're really espousing phenomenological theory, if you're really espousing multisensory experience, I think that projects like this need to be recognized as being more academically suited and not only experimental or subjective or for a gallery. You know, I think they're just as suited and more accurate in that sense. But it depends what your project is, like I was saying. So I think my kind of problem is more with our separation of these formats still, and how we're still segregating who can do what and in what space, which seems kind of outdated.
Do you feel like you see a bigger crossover now? I mean, as opposed to, I mean, for all of you, but as opposed to, you know, you're saying that in order to do this, we could have crossover from art into a scientific realm or vice versa, but have you noticed yourself that this is actually going on in other fields, or other people are actually attempting to do this as well?
I would just say quickly that science is incredibly artistic. I mean, it's essentially an abstract discipline. You know, how do we model atoms? How do we come up with graphs? I think the question then becomes, when is a graph considered not artistic? Even though it's a completely abstract concept. Someone's created this idea of what an atom looks like, or how do we represent this data, versus an infographic that becomes for a popular commercial, you know. So where are the divides here between what's considered scientific and what's not? Where they're both equally artistic and equally abstract and grounded potentially. But then it's the question of, you know, who's getting to decide what is then having merit or not.
Right.
Maybe I can, something about interdisciplinarity, actually, it's something that's become a buzzword these days, and I happen to be a fellow at an interdisciplinary center,
So you're
something. But it's interesting how it's always been around, and sort of this fascination with, you know, cross-disciplining and, you know, kind of tapping into other people's fields and other domains that are traditionally kind of segregated. And it's really interesting that in the past 5 years, it's been happening like all across the board in academia, actually. We're talking about academia. And, you know, I really think it's a very encouraging thing. But there's also, you know, a lot of people are voicing the opinion that interdisciplinary also masks, you know, like somewhat of the depth of certain fields, and, you know, it generates, anything that kind of, you know, comes new, whether it's new media or new ways of dealing with disciplines, like I think, you know, always go through this kind of, you know, sort of balancing act. And, but it's, to answer your question, Sam, I think it's really, really happening is that, you know, interdisciplinarity is becoming almost like a norm. And, you know, me actually being at the crossroads of looking for jobs, actually, like, most postdocs are interdisciplinary, but most faculty positions are still entrenched in their field. So there's a lot of cases in which you go, you know, do an interdisciplinary thing, you market yourself as interdisciplinary, and then you get these fabulous postdocs. You come out of it, and then, like, you fall through every single crack when it comes to faculty positions. But I mean, you know, there's this tension in you know, kind of the disciplinary world in academia, and I think, you know, we kind of, you know, need to continue to find balance.
Well, I think that's the take-home message from this session. Go forth and transform.